The morning sun painted the Montana mountains in shades of gold and purple as Catherine Riley stepped onto her wooden porch. Her boots made a soft creaking sound on the old planks that her husband had laid down 23 years ago. At 52, Catherine had the kind of strength that came from years of hard work. Her hands were rough from handling cattle and fixing fences. Her eyes were sharp from watching the horizon for trouble. The ranch stretched out before her like a green carpet dotted with brown and white cattle. 800 acres of the most beautiful land in Montana, surrounded by thick forests and tall rocky hills. This place had been their dream. She and William had saved every penny for 10 years before they could buy it. They had planned to grow old here together, watching their cattle grow fat and their bank account grow with them. But dreams don't always work out the way you plan them. 3 winters ago, William went out to check on the cattle during a bad snowstorm. The wind was howling like a wild animal, and the snow was coming down so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Catherine told him to wait until morning, but William was stubborn. He said the cattle might be trapped somewhere and needed help. They found his body 2 days later when the storm cleared. He had gotten lost in the whiteout and froze to death just half a mile from home. Catherine had to identify his body at the town mortuary. That was the hardest day of her life. The neighbors all said she should sell the ranch and move to town. A woman alone couldn't handle 800 acres and 100 head of cattle, they said. It was too dangerous, too hard, too much for one person. But Catherine had something to prove, not just to them, but to herself. This land was in her blood now. William was buried on the hill behind the house under a big oak tree where they used to sit and watch the sunset. The first year alone was the hardest. Fixing broken fences in the rain, delivering calves in the middle of the night, dealing with sick cattle when the vet was 2 hours away. But Catherine learned fast. She had to. The ranch was all she had left of the life she and William had built together. Then the mountain lions started coming. It began with small things. A calf found dead near the creek, torn up bad. Then another one, this time a full-grown cow. The local ranchers said it was just bad luck. Mountain lions had always been in these parts. But when Catherine lost her 3rd cow in 2 months, she knew this wasn't normal. Something was hunting her cattle, and it was getting bolder. The first time she saw the big cat, it was just after sunrise. She was walking to the barn when movement caught her eye. There, standing on a rock about 50 yards away, was the biggest mountain lion she had ever seen. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Golden fur, powerful muscles, and yellow eyes that seemed to look right through her. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then the cat turned and disappeared into the trees like it was never there. That night, Catherine couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about those yellow eyes and what they meant. This wasn't just any mountain lion passing through. This was a predator that had decided her ranch was its hunting ground. And if she didn't do something about it, she would lose everything. The next morning, she drove to town to buy a rifle. But old Pete at the gun store shook his head when she told him what she was planning. "Lady, you can't just go hunting mountain lions with a gun," he said. "They're too smart, too fast. You'll never get close enough for a clean shot, and if you wound one, it'll be 10 times more dangerous." Catherine left the gun store empty-handed but not empty-minded. If she couldn't shoot the cat, she would have to find another way. That's when she remembered something William had told her about his grandfather. The old man had been a hunter back in the day, and he used to say that the best hunters didn't rely on guns. They relied on patience, skill, and understanding their prey. 3 days later, Catherine was sitting in Murphy's diner when she overheard 2 men talking at the next table. One of them was talking about an old Native American man who lived up in the hills. Joe Crowfeather, they called him. He was known for being one of the best trackers in the state, and he knew more about mountain lions than anyone alive. Catherine finished her coffee, paid her bill, and drove up into the hills to find Joe Crowfeather. She found him sitting outside a small cabin, carving a piece of wood with a knife that looked older than the mountains themselves. "You're the widow with the cat problem," he said before she could even introduce herself. "How did you know?" Catherine asked. Joe smiled and pointed to her boots. "Mud from your ranch, hair from a mountain lion on your jacket, and worry lines around your eyes that weren't there 6 months ago. The mountains tell stories to those who know how to listen." That was the beginning of Catherine's education in the ancient art of hunting mountain lions. But Joe didn't teach her to use a rifle or set traps. Instead, he taught her to think like a cat, to move like a cat, and to hunt like a cat. And the weapon he gave her wasn't a gun, it was a knife. Joe Crowfeather's lessons were unlike anything Catherine had ever imagined. For 3 months, she drove up to his cabin twice a week, and he taught her things that seemed impossible at first. A mountain lion is not your enemy, Joe explained on her first day of training. It's your teacher. You must learn to see the world through its eyes, feel the ground with its paws, and think with its mind. He started by teaching her to walk without making a sound. For hours, they practiced moving through the forest, stepping on rocks and fallen logs, avoiding branches that would snap and leaves that would crunch. Catherine's feet were sore and her legs ached, but slowly she began to understand the rhythm of silent movement. The cat hunts with patience, Joe said, watching her practice. It can wait for hours without moving a muscle. Can you do the same? They practiced sitting perfectly still in the woods for long periods. At first, Catherine could barely manage 10 minutes without fidgeting. But as weeks passed, she learned to become part of the forest itself. Birds would land near her, deer would walk past without noticing her, and once a raccoon even climbed over her boot. The most important lesson was about the knife. Joe's grandfather had passed down an old hunting knife with a bone handle and a blade that was sharp enough to cut through leather like paper, but using it required getting close to a mountain lion, which meant understanding exactly how they moved and when they were vulnerable. A cat has 3 moments of weakness, Joe taught her, when it's focused on prey, when it's eating, and when it's sleeping. Miss those moments and you'll never get another chance. By the end of winter, Catherine had learned to track a mountain lion through snow, read the signs of where it had been and where it was going, and move through the forest like a shadow. But she hadn't actually faced one yet. That changed in early spring. Catherine was checking her cattle near the north pasture when she found fresh tracks in the mud near the creek. Big paw prints, definitely from the mountain lion that had been killing her cows. The tracks were less than an hour old, which meant the cat was close. Following Joe's teachings, Catherine began to track the lion. She moved slowly and carefully, reading every sign: scratches on tree bark where the cat had sharpened its claws, a tuft of golden fur caught on a thorn bush, fresh scat that told her the cat had eaten recently, which meant it might be resting nearby. She found it sleeping on a flat rock about 30 feet above the creek. The big cat was lying in the afternoon sun, completely relaxed. This was the moment Joe had trained her for. Catherine approached from downwind, moving 1 step at a time. It took her almost an hour to get within striking distance. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure the cat would hear it, but she remembered Joe's words about patience and control. When she was close enough, Catherine waited for the perfect moment. The cat shifted in its sleep, exposing its neck. In one smooth motion, she struck with the knife, just as Joe had taught her. It was over in seconds. Catherine sat beside the dead mountain lion for a long time, feeling a mixture of relief, sadness, and pride. She had protected her cattle, but she had also taken the life of a magnificent creature. She whispered a prayer of thanks to both the cat and to Joe for teaching her what she needed to know. Word of Catherine's successful hunt spread slowly through the ranching community. At first, people didn't believe it. A woman killing a mountain lion with just a knife seemed impossible, but when more cats started threatening livestock in the area, and Catherine successfully hunted and killed them too, the whispers grew louder. Over the next 2 years, Catherine killed 6 more mountain lions that were hunting her cattle. Each hunt was different, requiring different tactics and timing. One cat she tracked for 3 days through rough country before finding her chance. Another she waited for in a tree for 6 hours until it came to drink at the creek below. The Native American communities in the area began to speak of Catherine with respect. They called her Catwoman and said she had been blessed by the spirits of the mountains. Other ranchers started asking for her help when mountain lions threatened their herds, but Catherine always refused. This wasn't something she did for money or fame. It was something she did to survive. Joe Crowfeather was proud of his student. "You have learned the old ways," he told her. "Your husband's spirit can rest easy knowing you can protect what he left behind." But Catherine's reputation was spreading beyond just the local community. In the saloons and trading posts, men would talk about the widow who hunted mountain lions with a knife. Some told the stories with respect, others with disbelief, but all agreed on one thing. Catherine Riley was not someone to mess with. The stories grew with each telling. Some said she could track any animal through any terrain. Others claimed she could move through the forest without disturbing a single leaf. A few even whispered that she had some kind of supernatural power that let her communicate with wild animals. Catherine heard these stories when she went to town for supplies, and they made her uncomfortable. She wasn't a legend or a hero. She was just a woman trying to keep her ranch running and her cattle safe. But she also understood that having a fearsome reputation might keep other kinds of trouble away from her door. She had no idea that word of her unusual skills had reached the wrong ears, and that trouble was already heading her way. The Red Creek Gang had been terrorizing ranches across 3 counties for almost a year. Led by a cold-blooded outlaw named Frank Morrison, the 5-man gang had perfected a brutal system of robbery that left their victims with nothing but fear and empty pockets. Morrison was a tall, thin man with pale gray eyes and a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. He had gotten that scar in a knife fight in Denver 5 years earlier, and it had taught him that violence was the quickest way to get what he wanted. The other 4 men in his gang were just as dangerous. Tommy Bull Richards, a massive man who could break down a door with his bare hands. Jake and Jerry Tooley, twin brothers who were fast with their guns and faster with their fists. And Carlos Mendez, a former cavalry scout who could track anyone anywhere. Their method was simple and effective. They would target isolated ranches, especially those run by people who looked vulnerable. They would arrive in force, demand everything of value, and make it clear that resistance would result in violence. Most victims simply handed over their money, livestock, and anything else the gang wanted. Those who refused to cooperate were beaten or worse. The gang had hit 7 ranches in the past 3 months, always staying one step ahead of the law. They knew the territory well and had hideouts scattered across the mountains where they could disappear when things got too hot. Sheriff's pauses had been tracking them for months but never seemed to get close. It was in Murphy's Diner, the same place where Catherine had first heard about Joe Crowfeather, that Morrison learned about the Riley Ranch. He was sitting in a corner booth, keeping his hat pulled low and his voice quiet, when he overheard 2 local ranchers talking about Catherine. "That widow woman is sitting on some of the best land in the valley," one of them was saying. 800 acres, good water rights, and probably 100 head of cattle. "Must be worth a fortune." "Yeah, but she's tougher than she looks," the other rancher replied. "I heard she kills mountain lions with just a knife. Sounds crazy to me, but that's what people say." Morrison almost laughed out loud. Mountain lions with a knife? That was the kind of tall tale that bored ranchers liked to tell over their coffee. Even if it was true, what did that matter? A woman alone, no matter how tough she thought she was, couldn't stand up to 5 armed men. After the ranchers left, Morrison questioned the waitress about Catherine. The woman was happy to chat, especially after Morrison left her a generous tip. She told him all about Catherine's ranch, how to get there, and confirmed that the widow lived alone. "She comes to town every 2 weeks for supplies," the waitress said. "Always pays in cash, always buys good quality goods. Definitely has money saved up somewhere." That night, Morrison gathered his gang around their campfire to plan their next job. He described the Riley Ranch and painted a picture of an easy target: a lone woman with valuable land, cattle, and probably a good amount of cash hidden somewhere on the property. "This sounds too easy," Bull Richards said, scratching his thick beard. "What's the catch?" "No catch," Morrison replied. "Just some old stories about her hunting wild animals. You know how these country folks like to exaggerate." Jake Tooley was cleaning his pistol and seemed more interested. "How much you think we can get?" "Enough to make it worth our while," Morrison said. "The land alone is worth thousands, plus whatever cattle we can drive off and sell. And if she's got cash hidden in the house, even better." Carlos Mendez, who had been silent up until now, spoke up. "I don't like hitting women. It brings bad luck." Morrison's eyes went cold. "Carlos, we've been through this before. We take what we want from whoever has it. If you're getting soft, you can always leave the gang." Carlos shook his head quickly. He knew what happened to people who crossed Frank Morrison. "No, I'm with you. Just saying we should be careful." "We'll be careful," Morrison said, "but we'll also be rich." They spent the next 2 days planning the raid. Carlos scouted the approaches to the ranch and reported back that it was perfectly positioned for their purposes. The house sat in a valley with only one main road leading to it. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, which meant no one would hear any noise. And the ranch was surrounded by rough wooded country where they could escape if law enforcement showed up. On the morning of the raid, the 5 men rode out before dawn. They were all well armed and confident. Morrison carried 2 pistols and a rifle. Bull Richards had his favorite shotgun and a club he had made from a piece of oak. The Tooley twins each carried matching revolvers that they could draw and fire faster than most men could blink. Carlos had his rifle and the long knife he had carried since his cavalry days. As they rode toward the Riley ranch, the men joked about how easy this job was going to be. They had done this so many times before, and it always ended the same way. The victim would be scared, they would take what they wanted, and they would disappear into the mountains with their pockets full. "Think she'll try to fight?" Jerry Tooley asked with a grin. "They always think about it," Morrison said. "But when they see 5 guns pointed at them, they usually change their minds real quick." "What if she doesn't?" Jake asked. Morrison's hand moved to his pistol. "Then we'll change her mind for her." As they got closer to the ranch, Carlos began to feel uneasy. Something about this job didn't feel right, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. The morning was too quiet, the air too still. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. "Maybe we should wait and watch the place for a while," he suggested. "Make sure she's really alone." Morrison shook his head. "We've waited long enough. Time to get this done." They could see the ranch house now, sitting peaceful and quiet in the valley below. Smoke was coming from the chimney, which meant Catherine was home and probably having her morning coffee. It looked like the perfect target, isolated, defensible, and occupied by someone who had no idea what was coming. But as the 5 riders made their way down the dirt road toward the house, none of them noticed the figure watching them from the kitchen window. Catherine had spotted them the moment they entered the valley, and she was already making her preparations. The Red Creek gang thought they were hunting a helpless widow. They had no idea they were about to become the prey. Catherine was pouring her second cup of coffee when she saw the riders coming down the valley road. 5 men on horseback, moving with the kind of purpose that meant trouble. She had lived on this ranch long enough to know the difference between neighbors stopping by for a friendly visit and predators looking for prey. She set down her coffee cup and moved away from the window, her mind already shifting into the focused state that Joe Crowfeather had taught her. Think like the prey, he had always said, but hunt like the predator. These men thought they were coming to hunt her, but they had no idea what they were walking into. Catherine walked calmly to the wooden chest beside her bed and took out the knife that Joe had given her. The bone handle felt familiar and comforting in her palm. She had used this blade to kill 7 mountain lions, and each time it had served her well. She strapped the leather sheath to her belt and pulled her jacket over it to keep it hidden. Through the front window, she could see the riders more clearly now. They were heavily armed, and they moved with the confidence of men who had done this kind of thing many times before. The leader was a thin man with cold eyes who kept his hand near his pistol. Behind him rode a giant of a man who looked like he could tear a tree in half with his bare hands. The other 3 were younger but no less dangerous looking. Catherine stepped out onto her front porch just as the riders reached her yard. She kept her hands visible and her posture relaxed, but every muscle in her body was ready to move. The morning air was crisp and still, and she could hear the leather creaking as the men shifted in their saddles. Frank Morrison dismounted and walked toward the porch with an arrogant smile on his scarred face. He moved like a man who was used to getting what he wanted through intimidation and violence. "Morning, ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a mocking gesture of politeness. "Nice little place you got here." Catherine studied him carefully, noting the way he stood, the weapons he carried, and the distance between them. About 15 feet, close enough for her to reach him in 3 quick steps if she needed to. "Thank you," she replied calmly. "Can I help you with something?" Morrison's smile got wider, but his eyes stayed cold. "As a matter of fact, you can. Me and my boys here are businessmen, and we're looking to make some investments in this area, particularly in land, cattle, and any cash you might have lying around." The other 4 men had spread out in a loose semicircle around the porch, but they stayed mounted. Catherine could see that they were trying to surround her while making it look casual. These men had definitely done this before. "I'm not interested in selling," Catherine said. Morrison laughed and shook his head. "Oh, I don't think you understand, ma'am. This isn't really a buying and selling situation. This is more of a taking situation." He took a step closer to the porch, and Catherine could see the gun belt around his waist. 2 pistols, both worn low and tied down like a professional gunfighter. But Catherine had learned from hunting mountain lions that the most dangerous predator wasn't always the one with the biggest claws. "I think you gentlemen should leave," Catherine said, her voice still calm and steady. Bull Richards laughed from his horse. "Lady, you're in no position to be giving orders. There's 5 of us and 1 of you, and we're all armed. Morrison nodded toward the house. Here's how this is going to work. You're going to invite us inside for some coffee, and then you're going to show us where you keep your money. After that, we'll take a look at your cattle and decide which ones we want to drive off. If you cooperate, nobody gets hurt. If you don't. He let the threat hang in the air, his hand moving closer to his pistol. Catherine had been in situations like this before, though never with humans. She had faced down charging mountain lions, waited in perfect stillness while deadly predators moved around her, and made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. This was no different. I said you should leave, she repeated, but now there was something different in her voice, something that made Carlos Mendez shift nervously in his saddle. Morrison's patience was running out. He was used to victims who begged and pleaded, not stubborn women who refused to see reason. Lady, I don't think you're hearing me. We're not asking. We're telling. He reached for his gun to emphasize his point, but he never got the chance to draw it. Catherine's hand moved to her knife with the fluid speed of a striking snake. The blade left its sheath and flew through the air in one smooth motion, just as Joe had taught her. Morrison had time to look surprised before the knife buried itself deep in his chest. He staggered backward, looking down at the bone handle protruding from his body with shock and disbelief. That's impossible, he whispered, then collapsed to his knees and fell forward onto his face. For a moment, complete silence filled the yard. The 4 remaining bandits stared at their dead leader in stunned amazement. They had seen plenty of violence in their time, but they had never seen anyone move that fast or throw a knife with that kind of deadly accuracy. Bull Richards was the first to react. "Kill her!" he roared, reaching for his shotgun, but Catherine was already moving. Years of hunting mountain lions had taught her that after the first strike, you had to disappear immediately. She rolled behind the wooden water trough next to the porch, just as the first shots rang out. Bullets splintered the wood above her head and shattered the windows of her house. She killed Frank, Jake Tooley shouted, his voice high with shock and fear. Just some lucky throw, his brother Jerry replied, but his voice didn't sound very confident. Catherine crouched behind the water trough, listening to the horses moving around as the men tried to get better angles on her position. She could hear them talking to each other, trying to figure out what to do without their leader. They were used to following orders, not making decisions, but Catherine was in her element now. This was just like hunting mountain lions, except these predators were clumsy and loud. They announced their movements with heavy footsteps and shouted instructions. They had no idea how to hunt someone who understood the art of becoming invisible. She reached down and pulled a second knife from her boot, a smaller blade that she always carried as backup. Then she began to move, staying low and using the scattered farm equipment and outbuildings as cover. The bandits thought they had her trapped, but they were wrong. The hunt was just beginning, and Catherine had the advantage. The 4 remaining bandits spread out around Catherine's property with their guns drawn, trying to figure out where she had gone. They were used to dealing with scared victims who either surrendered immediately or tried to run away screaming. They had never faced someone who simply vanished like smoke. Bull Richards dismounted from his horse near the barn, his massive frame making the wooden boards creak under his weight. He carried his shotgun in one hand and wiped sweat from his forehead with the other, even though the morning air was cool. "Where'd she go?" he called out to the others. "Can't see her anywhere," Jake Tooley replied from his position near the chicken coop. "Maybe she's hiding in the house." Carlos Mendez had taken cover behind a wagon and was scanning the tree line beyond the pasture. His cavalry training told him that something was very wrong about this situation. "I don't like this," he said. Frank was fast with a gun and she took him down like it was nothing. "It was just luck," Jerry Tooley insisted, but his voice sounded uncertain. "Nobody's that good with a knife." Meanwhile, Catherine had already reached the rocky area behind her house where she had practiced moving silently for months with Joe Crowfeather. This was terrain she knew better than her own home. Every rock, every tree, every shadow was familiar to her. She had hunted mountain lions through these same hills, and now she would use everything she had learned. She moved through the landscape like a ghost, placing each step carefully to avoid loose stones or dry branches that might make noise. The bandits were making plenty of noise themselves, shouting to each other and stomping around in their heavy boots. They might as well have been ringing bells to announce where they were. Catherine worked her way around to the east side of the property, using a dry creek bed to stay hidden. She could see Bull Richards from her position, standing beside the barn and looking around nervously. He was too far away for her to reach with the knife, but she needed to separate the men anyway. Fighting 4 armed bandits at once would be suicide, even for someone with her skills. She picked up a small stone and threw it toward the chicken coop where Jake Tooley was hiding. The stone hit the wooden wall with a soft thunk, and Jake immediately spun toward the sound with his gun raised. "She's over here," he called out, moving toward the sound. Catherine was already moving again, circling around toward the wagon where Carlos was positioned. As Jake moved away from the chicken coop to investigate the noise, he left his back exposed. Catherine began to stalk him just like she would stalk a mountain lion. She approached from his blind spot, moving 1 step at a time and freezing whenever he looked in her direction. It took her 10 minutes to get within striking distance, but Jake had no idea she was there. He was focused on trying to see into the shadows near the chicken coop, expecting her to come from the front. When Catherine was close enough, she struck with the same silent efficiency she had used on mountain lions. The small knife slipped between Jake's ribs and found his heart before he could make a sound. He collapsed silently, and Catherine caught his body before it could hit the ground and make noise. 1 down, 3 to go. She took Jake's pistol and checked to make sure it was loaded. Catherine wasn't comfortable with guns, but having a backup weapon might be useful. She also took his ammunition and a second knife she found in his boot. "Jake," Jerry Tooley called out from his position near the house. "You see anything over there?" When his brother didn't answer, Jerry began to get worried. "Jake, answer me!" Catherine smiled grimly. The mountain lions she hunted were smart enough to stay quiet when they were being stalked. These bandits kept calling out to each other, making it easy for her to track their movements. She left Jake's body hidden behind the chicken coop and began to work her way toward Jerry's position. But this time she decided to try a different approach. Instead of getting close enough to use the knife, she would use the bandits' own fear against them. Catherine found a position in the rocks about 50 yards from the house where she could see Jerry, but he couldn't see her. She picked up a handful of small stones and began throwing them one at a time in different directions around Jerry's position. Each stone made a small noise when it landed, causing Jerry to spin around and point his gun at shadows. "She's all around us," Jerry shouted, his voice starting to crack with panic. "I can hear her moving." Bull Richards came running over from the barn, his shotgun ready. "Where is she?" "I don't know," Jerry said, sweat pouring down his face despite the cool morning air. "I keep hearing noises, but I can't see anything." Carlos had also moved closer to the house, and now all 3 remaining bandits were clustered together near the front porch. This was exactly what Catherine wanted. Frightened prey always tried to group together for protection, but that just made them easier targets. She worked her way closer, using the scattered farm equipment as cover. There was an old plow about 20 yards from where the men were standing, and Catherine was able to reach it without being seen. From there, she could hear their conversation clearly. "This is wrong," Carlos was saying. "That woman isn't normal. Nobody moves like that." "She's just one person," Bull insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "We've got guns and she's got what, a couple of knives?" "She killed Frank before he could even draw," Jerry pointed out. "And now Jake's not answering. Something happened to him. Maybe he found her and he's keeping quiet," Bull suggested, but even he didn't sound like he believed it. Catherine listened to their fear growing and knew it was time to strike again. Fear made people make mistakes, and mistakes got people killed. She had learned that lesson from watching mountain lions panic when they realized they were being hunted. She circled around to approach the men from behind, moving through the tall grass near the pasture fence. The morning dew helped muffle any sound her movements might make, and the wind was blowing toward her, which meant the men couldn't catch her scent, even if they had been smart enough to pay attention to such things. When she was in position, Catherine prepared to take down the second bandit. But this time she wouldn't be able to kill silently. The men were too close together, and one of them would see her coming. That meant she would have to move fast and be ready for a fight. Catherine took a deep breath and remembered Joe Crowfeather's words. The mountain lion strikes when the prey least expects it, but once the hunt begins, there is no going back. The hunt was about to become much more dangerous. Catherine crouched in the tall grass, watching the 3 remaining bandits huddled together near her front porch. They were scared now, and scared men made poor decisions. But they were also dangerous, and she knew that cornered animals often fought the hardest. Carlos Mendez was the most alert of the 3. constantly scanning the horizon and listening for sounds. His military training was showing, and Catherine recognized that he would be the most difficult to surprise. Bull Richards was trying to act tough, but she could see the way his hands shook slightly as he gripped his shotgun. Jerry Tooley was openly panicking, jumping at every sound and constantly calling out for his dead brother. Catherine decided to target Jerry first. His fear was making him careless, and his panic was affecting the other two men. Take out the weakest. Link and the others would become even more frightened. She began to move through the grass, staying low and using the morning shadows to hide her approach. It took her 15 minutes to work her way around to a position where she could reach Jerry without being seen by the others. She was now only 10 feet away from the three men, close enough to hear their whispered conversation. "We should get out of here," Jerry was saying, his voice barely above a whisper. "This whole thing has gone wrong." "We're not leaving without finishing the job," Bull replied, but his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. "Frank would want us to see this through." "Frank is dead," Jerry shot back. "And Jake isn't answering because he's probably dead too. This woman is some kind of witch or something." Carlos shook his head. "She's not a witch. She's just a very good hunter. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Catherine had heard enough. She rose from the grass like a shadow coming to life and moved toward Jerry with the fluid motion that Joe Crowfeather had taught her. Jerry was facing away from her, still looking toward the barn where he thought his brother might be hiding. The knife went in between his shoulder blades, finding his heart with surgical precision. Jerry made a small gasping sound and collapsed forward. By the time Bull and Carlos realized what had happened, Catherine was already moving again. Bull spun around with his shotgun, but Catherine was no longer where she had been. She had dropped to the ground and rolled behind the water trough, just as the big man fired both barrels where she had been standing a second earlier. "There!" Bull shouted. "She's behind the trough." Carlos was more tactical. Instead of shooting blindly, he began to move to get a better angle while Bull reloaded his shotgun. Catherine could hear his careful footsteps moving around the side of the porch. She waited until Bull finished reloading, then made her move. Instead of staying hidden, she suddenly stood up and threw her second knife at Carlos, who was trying to flank her position. The blade caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to drop his rifle. Bull fired again, but Catherine was already moving. She sprinted toward the barn, using her knowledge of every obstacle and hiding place on her property. Bull's shotgun blast tore splinters from the barn door just as she disappeared inside. "I hit the Mexican," Bull called out, "but the woman got away again." Carlos was sitting on the ground, clutching his wounded shoulder. The knife had gone deep, and blood was seeping through his fingers. "She's in the barn," he said through gritted teeth. "We've got her trapped now." But Catherine wasn't trapped. She was in her element. The barn was full of hiding places, and she knew every inch of it. More importantly, she had weapons stored here. William had always kept a rifle and ammunition in the barn for dealing with wild animals, and Catherine had hidden additional knives in various locations around the property. She retrieved William's old hunting rifle from where she had hidden it behind a stack of hay bales. The weapon was well maintained and loaded with 5 rounds. Catherine had never been much of a shot with a rifle, preferring the silent efficiency of knives, but at close range, even she could hit a target the size of Bull Richards. Through a gap in the barn boards, she could see Bull approaching the door with his reloaded shotgun. Carlos was trying to stand up, but his wounded shoulder was making it difficult. Blood loss was weakening him, and Catherine could see that he wouldn't be a threat for much longer. Bull reached the barn door and paused, trying to peer into the darkness inside. "I know you're in there, lady," he called out. "Come out now and we'll make this quick." Catherine positioned herself in the hayloft above the door, where she had a clear shot down at anyone who entered. She had used this same position 2 years earlier when a wounded mountain lion had taken refuge in her barn. That cat had been desperate and dangerous, just like Bull Richards was now. "You killed my friends," Bull continued, his voice getting angrier. "That wasn't very neighborly of you." Catherine smiled grimly at that. These men had come to rob her, probably kill her and take everything she had worked for. Now Bull was complaining about neighborliness. "I'm coming in," Bull announced. "And when I find you, you're going to pay for what you did." He stepped through the barn door with his shotgun ready, moving slowly and trying to let his eyes adjust to the dim light inside. Catherine waited until he was directly below her position, then spoke. "Looking for me?" Bull spun around and looked up just in time to see the rifle barrel pointing down at him. Catherine pulled the trigger, and the big man collapsed to the barn floor without firing a shot. That left only Carlos, and he was wounded and weaponless. Catherine climbed down from the hayloft and walked to the barn door, where she could see Carlos still sitting on the ground near the porch. He was very pale now, and the blood stain on his shirt was growing larger. She walked out of the barn with the rifle in her hands and approached Carlos slowly. He looked up at her with a mixture of pain and resignation in his eyes. "You're very good," he said quietly. "I've never seen anyone move like that." Catherine stopped about 10 feet away from him, keeping the rifle ready but not pointing it directly at him. "You chose the wrong ranch to rob." Carlos nodded slowly. "Frank thought you'd be an easy target. A woman alone, no protection. He was wrong about a lot of things." "Yes, he was," Catherine agreed. Carlos was quiet for a moment, then looked at her curiously. "Those stories about you hunting mountain lions with a knife, are they true?" "Yes." "How many?" 7. Carlos whistled softly. 7 mountain lions, and now 4 men. You're quite the hunter." Catherine studied his face, trying to decide what to do with him. He was wounded and no longer a threat, but he was also a member of a gang that had terrorized innocent people. On the other hand, he seemed different from the others, less cruel, more thoughtful. "What's your name?" she asked. "Carlos Mendez. I used to be in the cavalry before I made some bad choices." "Why did you ride with them?" Carlos was quiet for a long time before answering. "After I left the army, I couldn't find honest work. Frank's gang took me in when nobody else would, but I never liked the violence. I just needed somewhere to belong." Catherine lowered the rifle slightly. "You have a choice now. You can bleed to death here, or you can promise me that you'll never rob another innocent person again." Carlos looked surprised. "You'd let me live?" "If you give me your word that you'll change your ways." A man's word should mean something. Carlos struggled to his feet, still clutching his wounded shoulder. "I give you my word, ma'am. I'll never ride with outlaws again." Catherine nodded. "There's a doctor in town. Get that shoulder looked at, then find honest work. If I hear that you've broken your promise, I'll come looking for you." Carlos touched his hat with his good hand. "Thank you for the second chance. I won't waste it." He walked slowly toward the horses that were still tied up near the house, favoring his wounded side. Catherine watched him mount up and ride away, leaving behind the bodies of his former gang members and a changed life ahead of him. The Red Creek gang was finished, and Catherine Riley had proven that she was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. 3 days after the confrontation with the Red Creek gang, Catherine was tending to her cattle in the south pasture when she spotted riders approaching her ranch again. Her heart sank as she counted them through her field glasses. 6 men this time, all heavily armed and moving with the same predatory purpose as the last group. Word of what had happened to Frank Morrison's gang had spread quickly through the outlaw community. But instead of serving as a warning, it had attracted attention Catherine didn't want. These new riders were members of the Iron Horse gang, led by a man named Dutch Kruger, who had a reputation for being even more ruthless than Morrison had been. Catherine rode back to her house quickly, her mind already planning for another siege. She had hoped that killing the Red Creek gang would send a message that her ranch was off limits. But apparently some people needed to learn lessons the hard way. Dutch Kruger was a different kind of outlaw than Morrison had been. Where Morrison was impulsive and quick to anger, Kruger was patient and calculating. He had spent 2 days watching Catherine's ranch from the hills, studying her routines and looking for weaknesses. He had also brought more men and better weapons. The Iron Horse gang had been operating across the Western Territories for 3 years, and they had never failed to take what they wanted. Kruger had heard the stories about Catherine and the mountain lions, and while he respected her skills, he believed that no single person could stand against 6 well-armed and experienced fighters. Catherine watched from her kitchen window as the riders approached, noting their formation and weapons. These men were more professional than the last group. They spread out as they approached, making it harder for her to target them all. Their leader, a bearded man with cold blue eyes, dismounted and walked toward her porch with confident steps. "Mrs. Riley," Kruger called out, stopping a respectful distance from the house. "My name is Dutch Kruger. I believe you're acquainted with my business methods." Catherine stepped out onto her porch, her hand resting casually near her knife. "Can't say that I am, Mr. Kruger." Kruger smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I understand you had some trouble with Frank Morrison and his boys a few days ago." "Unfortunate business, that." "They chose their own fate," Catherine replied calmly. "Indeed they did," Kruger agreed. "Frank always was too impulsive for his own good. I, on the other hand, prefer to approach these situations with more strategy." As he spoke, Catherine noticed that his men had positioned themselves around her property more carefully than Morrison's gang had done. They were covering all the escape routes and had clear lines of sight to anywhere she might try to hide. These men had done their homework. "Here's what's going to happen," Kruger continued. "You're going to invite us into your home for a civilized discussion about the transfer of your property and assets. If you cooperate, this will be a business transaction. If you don't—" He gestured toward his men, who were all watching her with the cold eyes of professional killers. Catherine had faced this situation before, but this time was different. These men were better organized, better positioned, and they outnumbered the previous group. Still, she had advantages they didn't know about, and she had learned new tactics from her previous encounter. "I'm not interested in selling," Catherine said, using almost the same words she had used with Morrison. Kruger chuckled. "Oh, Mrs. Riley, I think you misunderstood. This isn't a negotiation. This is an inevitability. The only question is whether you make this easy or difficult for yourself." Catherine studied the positions of all 6 men, calculating distances and angles. The closest was about 20 feet away, too far for a knife throw. 2 others were positioned near her barn, 1 was watching the back of the house, and 2 more were mounted and ready to chase her if she tried to run. "I killed the last group of men who made me that offer," Catherine said quietly. "Yes, you did," Kruger acknowledged. "And that was impressive. Frank and his boys were careless and stupid. We are neither." He pulled out a pocket watch and checked the time. "I'm going to give you exactly 1 minute to decide, Mrs. Riley. Cooperate or face the consequences." Catherine used that minute to memorize every detail of the tactical situation. She noted which men were watching her most carefully, which ones had their weapons ready, and where her best cover was located. She also noticed something that gave her hope. Storm clouds were building over the mountains and the wind was starting to pick up. "Time's up," Kruger announced. "What's your decision?" "The same as it was 3 days ago," Catherine replied. Kruger sighed and shook his head. "I was hoping you'd be more reasonable than Frank gave you credit for. Boys, persuade the lady to reconsider." The shooting started immediately, but Catherine was already moving. She dove off the porch and rolled behind the water trough just as bullets shattered the windows of her house and splintered the wooden boards of the porch. But this time, instead of staying in one place, Catherine kept moving. She had learned from her previous fight that staying still allowed her enemies to surround her. This time, she would use the approaching storm and her knowledge of the terrain to turn the tables. She sprinted from the water trough to the chicken coop, then from the chicken coop to a pile of firewood, always staying 1 step ahead of the gunfire. The wind was getting stronger now and the first drops of rain were starting to fall. "Spread out," Kruger commanded. "Don't let her get to the rocks." But Catherine wasn't heading for the rocks behind her house this time. Instead, she was working her way toward the barn, where she had hidden additional weapons and supplies after the last attack. She had also prepared several nasty surprises for anyone who tried to follow her. As she reached the barn, Catherine triggered the first of her traps. A rope attached to a heavy bucket full of horseshoes swung down from the rafters, catching one of Kruger's men in the head and knocking him unconscious. "She's got traps," one of the men shouted. "Careful where you step," Kruger called back. The storm was getting stronger now, with heavy rain starting to fall and lightning beginning to flash across the sky. The rain would make tracking more difficult, and the lightning would provide moments of blinding light that Catherine could use to her advantage. She grabbed a rifle and ammunition from her hidden cache in the barn, then climbed up into the hayloft where she had a good view of the yard. Through the rain, she could see Kruger's men trying to coordinate their search, but the storm was making communication difficult. Catherine waited for the next lightning flash. then fired 3 quick shots from the hayloft. In the brief moment of bright light, she was able to target 2 of the men who were exposed in the open yard. Both went down, though she couldn't tell if they were dead or just wounded. "She's in the barn," Cougar shouted over the wind. "Burn it down!" But Catherine was already moving again. She had prepared for this possibility too. Using a rope she had rigged up weeks earlier, she swung from the hayloft to the roof of her house, then slid down the other side into the rocks behind the property. Now she was in her element. The storm, the darkness, and the familiar terrain all worked in her favor. Cougar and his remaining men were about to learn why the mountain lions had never stood a chance against her. The real hunt was just beginning. The storm raged through the night as Catherine moved through the rocks and trees behind her property like a ghost. The heavy rain had turned the ground muddy and slippery, but it also masked her movements and made tracking nearly impossible. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, terrifying moments, and thunder covered any small sounds she might make. Dutch Cougar and his 3 remaining men had taken shelter in Catherine's barn, trying to wait out the storm and plan their next move. They had lost 3 men to a woman who seemed to appear and disappear at will, and their confidence was shaking. "This isn't working," one of the men said, nervously checking his ammunition. "Maybe we should just cut our losses and get out of here." Cougar wiped rain from his beard and shook his head. "Nobody runs the Iron Horse Gang out of anywhere. We finish this job, or we don't deserve the reputation we've built." But even Cougar was beginning to doubt himself. He had underestimated Catherine Riley, just like Frank Morrison had done. The difference was that Cougar was smart enough to recognize his mistake and adapt to it. Outside in the storm, Catherine was methodically hunting the remaining gang members. She had retrieved additional knives from hiding places around her property, and she moved through the darkness with the patience and skill that Joe Crowfeather had taught her. Each flash of lightning gave her a glimpse of the barn and the surrounding area, allowing her to plan her approach. She decided to wait until the storm began to pass before making her final move. Patience had always been her greatest weapon, whether she was hunting mountain lions or dangerous men. Let them grow tired and careless while she remained alert and ready. Around midnight, the rain began to lighten and the wind started to die down. Catherine could see light coming from the barn where the men had built a small fire to stay warm. Their silhouettes were visible through gaps in the barn boards, making them easy targets. But Catherine had learned something important from her years of hunting. The most dangerous prey was always the most desperate. Cougar and his men knew they were trapped, which made them unpredictable and willing to take extreme risks. She approached the barn from the east side, where the prevailing wind would carry her scent away from the building. Moving one step at a time, she worked her way to within 10 feet of the barn wall. Through a gap in the boards, she could see the 3 men sitting around their fire, their weapons within easy reach. "She could be anywhere out there," one of them was saying. "For all we know, she's watching us right now." Cougar stood up and walked to the barn door, peering out into the darkness. "Maybe, but she's still just one person and we're still armed. When the sun comes up, we'll have the advantage again." Catherine decided that waiting for sunrise would be a mistake. These men were dangerous, and giving them time to reorganize and plan could be fatal. It was time to end this. She worked her way around to the back of the barn where she knew there was a small door that William had built for moving hay in and out. The door was old and warped, but it opened quietly if you knew how to lift it just right. Catherine slipped inside the barn like a shadow, moving through the stacked hay bales toward the light of the fire. The 3 men were only 20 feet away, completely unaware that death had entered their sanctuary. She threw her first knife at the man sitting with his back to her. He fell forward into the fire without making a sound, causing sparks to fly, and the other 2 men to jump to their feet in alarm. "She's in here," one of them shouted, grabbing for his gun. But Catherine was already moving again, disappearing back into the shadows between the hay bales. The barn was full of hiding places, and she knew every one of them while the men were disoriented and half-blinded by the firelight. Cougar drew his pistol and began firing into the darkness, hoping to hit Catherine by chance. But she was no longer where he was shooting. She had circled around behind him and struck with her second knife before he realized where she was. The last gang member panicked and ran for the barn door, but Catherine was faster. She tackled him before he could escape, and they struggled briefly on the ground before her knife found its mark. When Sheriff Tom Bradley rode up to the Riley Ranch 3 days later, he found Catherine sitting on her front porch drinking coffee as if nothing had happened. The barn had burned down during the storm, and the bodies of the Iron Horse gang were arranged in a neat row beside the smoldering ruins. "Afternoon, Catherine," the sheriff said, dismounting from his horse. "Got a report about gunshots and a fire up here." "Morning, Tom," Catherine replied calmly. "Some men came by a few days ago looking for trouble. They found it." Sheriff Bradley walked over to examine the bodies. He had seen the remains of the Red Creek gang just a few days earlier, and now here was another group of dead outlaws. Word was already spreading across the territory about the widow who had single-handedly eliminated two of the most dangerous gangs in the region. "That's Dutch Kruger," the sheriff said, kneeling beside one of the bodies. "He's been wanted in 3 states. There's a $1,000 bounty on his head." Catherine looked up with interest. "Is that so?" "Yes, ma'am. And his gang members are worth $500 each. You've just earned yourself quite a bit of money." Catherine smiled for the first time in days. "Well, that'll help pay for a new barn." As news of Catherine's second victory spread, her reputation grew from local legend to territory-wide fame. Newspapers as far away as Denver and San Francisco ran stories about the mountain lion woman who protected her ranch with nothing but knives and incredible skill. Other outlaws began to give the Riley Ranch a wide berth. Some said the place was cursed. Others claimed that Catherine had made a deal with the spirits of the mountains. A few insisted that she wasn't entirely human. Catherine didn't mind the stories. In fact, she encouraged them. The more dangerous her reputation became, the safer her ranch would be. She had learned that sometimes the best way to avoid a fight was to make sure your enemies were too scared to start one. Joe Crowfeather visited her a few weeks after the second battle. He examined the scene carefully, reading the signs of what had happened with the skill of a master tracker. "You have become the greatest hunter in these mountains," he told her with pride. "Even the mountain lions speak of you with respect now." Catherine laughed at that. "Do they really?" Joe's eyes twinkled with humor. "Well, they would if they could talk. But the point stands. You have earned your place in the legends of this land." Years later, when historians wrote about the settling of the Montana Territory, they would describe Catherine Riley as one of the most formidable figures of the frontier era. They would tell stories of the quiet widow who could track any prey through any terrain, who could move through the wilderness without disturbing a single leaf, and who protected her land with skills that seemed almost supernatural. But Catherine never thought of herself as a legend. She was just a woman who had learned to survive in a dangerous world, using lessons taught to her by the land itself and by the animals that lived on it. She had simply done what needed to be done to protect what was hers. And in the end, that was all any legend really was. Someone who refused to give up when giving up would have been easier. Catherine Riley lived on her ranch for 30 more years, raising cattle and living peacefully. She never had to use her hunting skills on human prey again, because by then, everyone knew better than to threaten the woman who had learned to hunt like a mountain lion. When she finally passed away at the age of 82, the entire territory mourned the loss of a true frontier hero. But her legend lived on, inspiring other women to stand up for themselves and reminding everyone that the most dangerous predator in any wilderness is the one you underestimate. The Riley Ranch still stands today, though it's been converted into a museum. Visitors can see the rocks where Catherine learned to move like a ghost, the creek where she first tracked mountain lions, and the rebuilt barn where she made her final stand against the Iron Horse gang. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the mountain wind blows through the valley, people say you can still hear the soft footsteps of the greatest hunter the Montana mountains ever knew.